Okay, let's dive into the second part of our exploration. Now, if the last discussion was all about critiquing old ideas, which, let's be honest, can sometimes feel a bit like shooting fish in a barrel, this one is about a much, much harder question. What do we do after the barrel is empty? What do we build? And the source material we're digging into today offers a constructive and pretty challenging proposal. It calls it a civilizational working draft. And it all starts right here with this core fact. The source argues that, when you get right down to it, from the perspective of our actual lived experience, the silence of a God who doesn't speak and the silence of no God at all feel exactly the same. What we actually experience is the silence. Everything else, all the stories, all the grand theories, that's just the architecture we've built to avoid having to really listen to it. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to diagnose the core human problem as the source sees it. Then we'll look at why past solutions just haven't worked. After that, we'll dive into a really detailed plan for what could come next before we slam right into its single biggest challenge. Now, the argument here isn't really about atheism versus theism. The source just kind of reframes the whole problem. It suggests the core issue isn't godlessness, but this profound, almost civilizational feeling of parentlessness. This longing is framed not as some kind of weakness or intellectual flaw, but as a real, legitimate psychological wound. It's the same shape as our earliest attachments to our parents, just, scaled up to the size of the entire cosmos. And understanding this wound, that's the key to understanding why we invent celestial parents to begin with. And here is where the perspective makes a crucial shift. The argument is that moving from inventing a parent all on your own to recognizing that we are all in this shared condition together, that's the only real foundation for solidarity. It's one that doesn't need some kind of cosmic permission slip to work. But the document is also brutally honest. It estimates that right now, under current conditions, with all the stress and trauma and precarity in the world, this worldview might only be psychologically bearable for about 15% of us. For the rest, understandably, when you feel like you're drowning, you're going to reach for a cosmic parent. And this forces a really important question. Is the difficulty of this idea a sign that the idea itself is just wrong? Or is it actually a measure of how incredibly deep that parent wound really is and how much work needs to be done to make the truth tolerable? Before you build something new, it's a pretty good idea to study the rubble of what came before. So the source takes a really hard look at why previous secular projects they just fell short. They never really gained traction on a civilizational scale. And this table just brilliantly illustrates 4 big traps. Any new approach has to avoid being too thin and bureaucratic, too tribal and authoritarian, too navel-gazingly individualistic, or just purely destructive without offering something to build in its place. It's got to be something else entirely. Okay, so let's get to the constructive part. This is the plan to, in the document's own words, civilizationally self-parent. And it's not a manifesto, it's not a holy book, it's framed as a set of load-bearing beams for a house that we have to build while we're all still living in it. And the entire project rests on these core acknowledgments. These aren't presented as beliefs you have to adopt, they're presented as statements of reality. The silence isn't going anywhere, that psychological wound is real, community and ritual are often way more powerful than a good argument, and any plan that's going to work has to be built with an urgency that reflects the scale of the mess we're in. So how do you actually build this house? The source proposes a structure for this new orphanage that's built on 5 big load-bearing beams. Each one is designed to address a fundamental human need that religion used to take care of. And these 5 steps outline a really comprehensive approach. It's not just about philosophy, It touches everything from economics and social infrastructure to ritual, moral education, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're doing here. The first beam is just bluntly material. Things like universal basic services, healthcare, housing, food. They're not just framed as economic policy, but as the basic infrastructure for psychological maturity. You can't really ask someone to face cosmic silence on an empty stomach. So the second beam, this tackles our need for ritual. But instead of just inventing new fake ceremonies, it proposes practices that directly acknowledge our shared condition. Think about secular funerals that don't have to pretend, coming-of-age ceremonies that ground us in our community, and maybe even weekly gatherings that just hold the silence together. So where does morality come from? The third beam argues that goodness isn't about obeying some celestial CEO. It's about the embedded practice of care that just naturally arises when you realize nobody else is coming. We take care of each other because, well, we are all we have. Now, this is a direct confrontation with apocalyptic thinking. So many of the old stories end with the world ending, and often that's seen as a good thing. This beam reframes our survival not as something we can take for granted, but as a continuous, active, and absolutely necessary choice. And the fifth beam is the news story. The news story we tell ourselves. It's not a story about being chosen or about being saved. It's a narrative of looking our situation square in the face and then doing the profound, difficult, and maybe even beautiful work of building something true right in the middle of it. But after laying out this entire ambitious plan, the document does something pretty remarkable. It confronts its own deepest and perhaps fatal weakness head-on. It calls this the objection that keeps it up at night. And there it is. This is the brutal self-critique. The old frameworks, the original fish from the first part, they offer a powerful, addictive psychological reward that the orphanage, by its very nature, cannot and will not provide. So, the crucial point is this stark choice. On one side, you have an offer that sells incredibly well, especially to people who are scared and suffering. It's their fault. And on the other side, you have an offer that asks for immense strength and the capacity to hold pain without needing an enemy. And the source doesn't even try to argue its way around this. It presents this problem not as a puzzle you can solve, but as a fundamental limit. It's an architectural wall in the whole project of secular meaning. The pleasure of righteous anger, it's like a force of nature. So when you're faced with that wall, the goal has to shift. The project isn't about civilizational replacement anymore. It becomes something smaller, more focused, and maybe more possible. Creating a home, a refuge, for that 15% who have already seen the silence and just can't go back to pretending. And that leaves us right here with the central, unresolved question of the whole project. It suggests that if there is no final solution to the allure of righteous hate, then the work isn't about finding an answer. The work is about figuring out how we proceed, honestly and effectively, in its absence.
You wake up one morning and the massive, comforting fortress you've lived your whole life in, the idea of a loving, all-powerful cosmic parent is just gone.
Right. It's just an empty lot.
Exactly. And most people, when faced with that terrifying silence, they don't just stand there. They panic. They grab the nearest authoritarian belief system they can find just to, put a roof over their heads.
Because the void is terrifying.
It is. So, welcome back, listener, to part 2 of our deep dive into the fascinating document, Fish and Parenting. Last time, we did the demolition work, right? We deconstructed the ancient mythologies, what the author calls the fish in a barrel, and we just stared right into that void.
Yeah, and the demolition really is the easy part, honestly. Tearing down an ancient intellectual framework just requires logic.
Yeah.
But logic alone just leaves you standing in the rubble of a demolished worldview.
Which brings us to today's mission. We're transitioning from demolition to architecture. Because if the old house is gone, what on earth do we build in its place?
If we don't build something intentionally, human nature practically guarantees we will build something reactive. And usually, that's something much more dangerous.
Right. How do we survive the morning after losing our cosmic parent without rushing right back into the arms of the nearest authoritarian system?
Well, before we can even pour the foundation for something new, we have to understand why it's so hard for people to leave the old structure behind.
Yeah.
Why do we cling to the fish?
And the text has this striking analogy for this, which I found fascinating. It basically says religion is like a high-stakes version of Santa Claus for adults.
It's a very precise structural comparison. And it's not meant to be mocking. It's just an analysis of the mechanism.
Right. Think about the components. You have an all-seeing judge who monitors your behavior. They know when you're sleeping, when you're awake.
You have a literal naughty and nice list.
Yes. And you have distributive justice at the end of the line. So presence versus coal for the child, or, heaven versus hell for the adult.
And critically, you have an entire community of adults maintaining this illusion for the benefit of the believer.
Okay, but let me push back on this a bit, or let's unpack it, because kids outgrow Santa by, age 8? And they're fine, they move on. Why don't adults just outgrow this celestial parent in the exact same way when they encounter, I don't know, science or history?
It comes down to the stakes. The stakes are entirely different. When a child loses the Santa illusion, the worst-case scenario is that a bit of the seasonal magic fades, but the presents keep arriving. Right. They just come from the parents now.
The material reality of their life doesn't collapse.
Exactly. But for an adult, when God stops mattering, everything is at risk. You might lose your community. Your marriage might fracture if your spouse is still a believer.
Your whole identity.
Yeah, your moral framework, the very reason you get out of bed in the morning, suddenly gone.
It's like realizing your parachute is actually just a backpack, but you're already in free fall.
That is exactly it. And the text refers to this as the 15% problem. It basically estimates that under current sociological conditions, only about 10 to 15% of the population can truly bear to let these frameworks go and sit in the silence.
Wow. Just 15%.
Yeah. And it's really crucial to note that this is an elegy, not an insult. It's not about intelligence.
Right.
It's about survival. The truth distributes itself opposite to need. The people who are most capable of seeing the parent as non-existent are generally the privileged, the materially safe, the untraumatized.
The ones who don't need a cosmic safety net anyway.
Exactly. While the people who most desperately need the parent to exist are those who are materially precarious or traumatized, because their psychological survival literally depends on it.
So if you're drowning, you don't want to lecture on hydrodynamics. You just want a life raft.
Yes. People aren't reaching for the parent god because they can't do logic. They're reaching for it because they're underwater.
Okay, so if losing this parent god is so terrifying because people think they'll be plunged into this, like, cold, meaningless universe, we really have to look at what was supposedly lost.
So we have to reframe that loss entirely.
Right, and there's this brilliant Douglas Adams quote mentioned in the text. He asks, "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?"
That quote perfectly summarizes the pivot required here. The beauty is actually there.
But honestly, isn't a universe infused with magic and a parent god who actively loves you vastly more appealing than just a cold, empty universe?
Well, see, that assumes the universe is cold.
Yeah.
The text makes a really careful distinction here. The universe isn't cold, it is merely indifferent.
Indifferent, right.
The wonder and awe you feel looking at a galaxy or listening to a symphony or looking at a child's face, that awe is real. It's a profound biological human experience. The fish didn't create that magic.
They just colonized it.
Exactly. They stole the garden and sold it back to us with fairies attached.
Oh, that's such a great way to put it. They convinced us that without the fairies, the flowers wouldn't actually be beautiful.
And this connects to a much darker side of attributing beauty to a creator, the shell game of theodicy.
Oh, right. Because if the fish gets credit for the beautiful sunrise, it logically has to take the blame for the stillbirth or the childhood leukemia. You can't just cherry-pick the divine resume.
You really can't. If God wrote the script, he wrote the whole script. Every defense of this, free will, God works in mysterious ways, it's for a greater good. Every single one is a shell game.
Yeah, mysterious ways, it's basically just a rhetorical trick where you decide in advance that no negative evidence counts.
Exactly. If we accept that we wrote the stories, then both the beauty and the horror belong to us. There's no cosmic scapegoat to blame and no cosmic rescuer to wait for.
It's a heavier responsibility, but it's the only honest one, which I think brings us to the core premise of part 2.
Right, the orphanage.
Yes. Once we accept that the beauty and horror are in human hands, we realize we aren't just godless, we are parentless. We are essentially squabbling orphans with nukes.
Which is a terrifying thought.
Truly. So how do orphans survive? They build an orphanage.
This is the concept of the recognized orphan. It's someone who knows no celestial backup is coming and uses that shared vulnerability as a foundation for human solidarity.
And the author breaks down this blueprint into 5 beams, right? 5 beams required to build this civilizational orphanage for the 85% who are currently drowning. Let's go through them. Beam 1 is material security.
Yes.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me, because Beam 1 just sounds like universal basic services or, honestly, socialism. Like, what does housing or healthcare have to do with replacing religion?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this isn't ideology at all. It's epidemiology.
Okay, explain that.
You cannot do orphan consciousness on an empty stomach. Precarity produces authoritarian religiosity.
So desperation breeds the need for the parent.
Exactly. When you don't know how you're going to pay rent or feed your kids, you desperately need a father figure in the sky who promises to fix it. If you want fewer people reaching for the fish, You have to reduce the material pressure that makes the fish so attractive in the first place.
Wow. Okay, that makes perfect sense. So what about beam 2? Rituals that hold the silence.
Right, like secular funerals or coming-of-age ceremonies that don't invent gods. Instead of filling the silence with false promises about a better place, a secular ritual holds the silence. It acknowledges the reality of the loss.
It provides a container for the grief.
Exactly. And beam 3 is moral formation, practicing care without needing cosmic permission.
Right. You feed the hungry because they're hungry, and we are both orphans in an indifferent universe, not because a god commanded it or because you're buying a ticket to heaven.
It replaces obedience with recognition. Then there's being for apocalypse inoculation.
Confronting the civilizational death wish.
Yes. In religious frameworks, the apocalypse isn't a tragedy, it's a rescue mission. It's when the parent finally returns. But when a civilization holds those beliefs and has nuclear weapons, it's incredibly dangerous. We have to treat the desire for the end of the world as a pathology.
And finally, beam 5, the orphan narrative.
The story that we are the ones we've been waiting for. Everything good that will ever happen to us, we have to build ourselves.
It's a story of profound dignity. Okay, so the blueprint sounds brilliant, but every honest plan eventually hits a wall. Why might the orphanage ultimately fail against the original fish?
Because the original fish has a killer feature that the orphanage can never, ever replicate.
The permission to hate.
Yes, it is the darkest, most devastating point in the text. The parent god doesn't just allow you to feel self-righteous, it actively rewards you for it. It says, your suffering is someone else's fault, and here is cosmic permission to destroy them.
But wait, so what does this all mean? Can't we just defang the fish? You know, progressive religion that just sands off all the sharp corners, preaches love, gets rid of the tribalism.
The author completely dismantles the defanged fish idea. Progressive religion is basically a luxury good. It works when times are good, but it is utterly futile in an emergency.
The text brings up the Weimar Republic here, right?
Yes, the ultimate historical warning. When the economy is stable in the Weimar Republic, you had sophisticated, nuanced, progressive religious frameworks. But then the Great Depression hit, hyperinflation.
People's savings wiped out overnight.
Right, meaning disappears, people are humiliated and terrified. And in that environment, the defanged fish offers nothing. Frightened people don't want nuanced theological reflections on complexity.
They want a scapegoat.
Exactly. So the original fish returns, sometimes wrapped in a swastika, offering absolute certainty, clear enemies, and a restored father figure. The permission to hate is not a bug. It is the killer feature that sells perfectly to frightened people.
So the bitter truth is that the orphanage will always lose to the original fish under conditions of scarcity and fear. We can't solve this.
We can't. We can only mitigate it by reducing the conditions that make hate attractive, which goes back to beam 1, material security.
Right.
And by building the orphanage as a refuge for the 15% who've already seen the silence and simply can't unsee it.
So to summarize this whole journey for you, the listener, we've gone from realizing we are basically adults clinging to a high-stakes Santa Claus to reclaiming our natural wonder from the fairies.
And then moving to the daunting but totally necessary task of building an orphanage for a parentless species.
Right, all while fighting this deeply ingrained human desire for the permission to hate. And why should you care about all of this? Because, as the sources warn, we are a species with Bronze Age tribal epistemology running on nuclear hardware.
The psychological gap between an ancient tribe wiping out a village and a modern leader launching a nuclear strike is practically zero.
We are the orphans, and the children with the nukes are not going to wait around for certainty.
Which makes this work incredibly urgent.
It really does. I want to leave you with a final lingering thought from the text. Living inside the silence isn't a theory or a blog post or a debate. It's a room. It's a chair. It's the profound silence held together by two people who have agreed, without even saying so, not to fill it with fish.
That's beautifully put.
So the next time you face the terrifying silence of an indifferent universe, will you reach for the fish? Or will you pull up a chair and sit in it with a fellow orphan?